Ah, the Victorian era. A time of stiff collars, stricter morals, and medical advice that could kill you faster than the disease itself. But while doctors were out there sawing limbs and prescribing arsenic like it was herbal tea, someone had to do the dirty work behind the scenes. Enter the leech collector. Yes, that was a real job. And no, it didn't pay well. It was wet, cold, humiliating, and involved a lot of blood, mostly not your own. But don't worry, that's just the start of our tour through history's most just kill me now jobs. If you've ever complained about your job, just wait. Like, subscribe, and stick around. This is the darkly delightful history lesson your boss doesn't want you to hear. Let's set the scene. It's 5 a.m. The fog is hanging low over the English marshlands, and everything is that special kind of damp that seeps into your bones and stays there like an unpaid debt. You're barefoot, ankle deep in stagnant water that smells like a compost bin's emotional breakdown, and you've got one job: stand very still and bleed. Welcome to the prestigious and not at all traumatizing career of a Victorian leech collector. Now, you may be wondering, why barefoot? Good question. See, the Victorian medical community, bless their misguided bloodthirsty hearts, believed that the key to health was removing blood from your body, and not in a chic vampire way. More like, got a headache? Let's drain a pint and see what happens. Leeches were the artisanal tools of the day, a sort of reusable syringe with teeth, but someone had to collect them, and who better than poor women and children, who were already used to being walked on by society. So why not let a few invertebrates join the fun? So here you are, 13 years old if you're lucky, barefoot because leeches are picky little suckers. They prefer fresh skin, warm blood, and a whiff of despair. You wade quietly into the muck, arms spread out like you're in some kind of tragic marshland ballet, and then the waiting begins. At first, nothing, then a tickle, then a pinch, then another. Suddenly, your legs are dotted with little black commas, wriggling happily as they siphon your essence one drop at a time. It's not glamorous. It's not even particularly profitable. On a good day, you might collect a few dozen and sell them to a surgeon who believes bad thoughts live in the blood. On a bad day, you lose a toe to infection and get paid in fleas. Let that sink in. This wasn't some obscure fringe job done once a year at the harvest festival. Leech collecting was an actual, recognized form of labor, like being a barista, except instead of oat milk and passive aggression, you dealt in open wounds and trench foot. But to understand how this delightfully horrifying job came to be, we need to peek behind the soggy curtain of Victorian medicine. The 19th century was a thrilling time for science. Thrilling in the way that driving a horse-drawn carriage off a cliff is thrilling. Medicine was caught between ancient Greek theories and Victorian guesswork, with just a sprinkling of actual discovery. Humorism, the belief that the body was ruled by 4 bodily fluids, was somehow still a thing, and leeches were seen as nature's polite way of rebalancing your temperament by draining your vital essence. Too excitable? Let's bleed you. Feeling blue? More bleeding. Lost a finger? Sounds like you're holding too much blood. This national obsession with bloodletting meant leeches were worth their slimy weight in gold, or at least in shillings, which is about as exciting as it got for the average marshwoider. Leeches were so in demand that the population of wild leeches in England was decimated. Entire ponds were sucked dry, not of water, but of their living inventory. Enterprising leech collectors had to go farther and deeper into remote wetlands, often risking dysentery, frostbite, and the general unpleasantness of being alive during the reign of Queen Victoria. There's something almost poetic about it, really. The leech collector, quietly sacrificing her blood so that someone wealthier can have theirs sucked out in a clinic with wallpaper. It's a cycle of absurdity so tight it makes your spleen ache. Some even used livestock when available. Old texts mention horses being led into ponds and then stripped of leeches like muddy fruit off a tree. But horses, as it turns out, are expensive. Children? Not so much. A tragic economic equation solved daily by families with more mouths than money. And if the leeches didn't get you, the water might. These weren't exactly sparkling mineral springs. We're talking about fetid, insect-laden swamps, marinated in the runoff of 19th century village life. Every toe dipped was an invitation to tetanus, and every bite was a gamble with infection. Still think your job sucks? So, there you stand. Cold, half bleeding, slightly dizzy, wondering whether 5 more leeches is worth losing your last good sock. And in the distance, the sun starts to rise. Not that it makes anything warmer, the marsh remains quiet, broken only by the occasional plop of a bullfrog or the cursed squelch of someone slipping in the mud. And yet somehow this is normal. This is routine. This is survival. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity, and we will, oh yes. Plenty more ahead. But don't forget that these were real people. Girls named Anne or Margaret who never learned to read, but could spot a leech's ripple from 20 paces. Women who lived with permanently scarred legs, and the eerie knowledge that their suffering kept someone else's bloodletting dreams alive. So next time you shudder at the thought of clocking in, maybe pause and be grateful you're not wading into a disease swamp, hoping today's batch of facehuggers is enough to keep the landlord at bay. Because for the Victorian Leech collector, every day was a blood drive, just not the voluntary kind. So, let's zoom out for a second. Away from the bog-sodden feet of our leech-wielding heroines. Away from the parasite-covered ankles, and into the candle-lit, brass-instrumented inner sanctum of a Victorian medical practitioner. Picture this. The doctor enters in full waistcoat glory, smelling faintly of pipe smoke, old leather, and possibly last week's patient. He has a look of confidence, which is impressive, considering the fact that nothing he's about to do actually works. Welcome to the golden age of medicine, if by golden you mean good luck surviving. Now, to understand why the British Empire was practically drowning in leeches, we need to understand the brain trust behind it. Victorian physicians were armed with an impressive array of tools, saws, forceps, trepanation drills, and exactly zero understanding of germ theory until the latter half of the 19th century, and yet somehow they wielded these instruments like the hand of God, if God had recently dropped out of veterinary school and was winging it. Let's talk humours. No, not humour, which would have been a blessed relief. I'm talking about the 4 humours, an ancient Greek theory still clinging to life like an overripe corpse in the Victorian imagination. According to this model, your health was governed by 4 magical body juices: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea was to keep these in balance, which, spoiler, you never were, and the best way to fix it was often by forcibly removing the ones you had too much of. Enter bloodletting, vomiting, blistering, and, let's not forget, the time-honored tradition of inserting things where things should not be inserted. If that sounds primitive, that's because it was, and yet this pseudo-scientific chaos ruled the medical world for centuries. By the time of the Victorians, you'd think we'd have moved on. We hadn't. In fact, in some ways, it got worse, because now we had technology. New instruments flooded in, shiny, intimidating, and often operated with all the subtlety of a jackhammer. There was the scarificator, a lovely little brass box with a spring-loaded blade that popped out and made dozens of incisions in your skin in under a second. Fun for parties. Then there were cupping glasses, which were heated and placed on the body to draw out impurities, a method that left you looking like you'd been attacked by a suction-obsessed octopus. But let's not leave out the barbers. Yes, those cheerful red and white poles outside barbershops. Those aren't just design flair. They're literal references to bloodletting. Red for blood, white for bandages. And the pole, that was the stick you gripped while your veins got a makeover. Oh, and if your local doctor was too expensive, don't worry. The Victorian quack market was booming. Snake oil salesmen, magnetic healers, and clairvoyant physicians peddled everything from cocaine tonics to arsenic wafers. That's right, if your complexion looked dull, you could simply eat poison and hope for a nice glow before the internal bleeding started. And yes, people died. Frequently. But they often died fashionably. Still feeling nostalgic? By the mid-1800s, cholera was sweeping through London's water like it was on a mission. But doctors, armed with centuries of misinformation, blamed everything except bacteria. Bad air, they said. Miasma. That was the true villain. And thus, treatments involved opening windows, waving around lavender sachets, and praying the stench didn't kill you before the disease did. It was basically aromatherapy for an intestinal apocalypse. But things weren't entirely bleak. Some real progress was made, just very slowly, and usually in between disasters. Florence Nightingale began shouting at people to wash their damn hands, and Joseph Lister eventually introduced antiseptic surgery, which revolutionized medicine and probably prevented more accidental amputations than we'll ever know. But until that happened, surgeons just reused their tools between patients. No gloves, no masks, just vibes. Hospitals were essentially infection factories with mood lighting. Imagine a surgical theatre packed with spectators. Literally, they sold tickets. And a surgeon hacking through a leg while his apron stiffened with layers of dried blood. If the patient survived the operation, they still had to survive the next few days in a building full of open wounds, dirty linens, and a working understanding of clean that stopped at the phrase, "Well, it's not that bloody." And if you were pregnant, best of luck. Victorian obstetrics was like rolling a pair of blood-stained dice and hoping for a midwife who didn't pass out halfway through. Forceps were used with all the finesse of a claw machine. And ether, a brand new anesthetic, often knocked patients out forever instead of just temporarily. Even mental health treatments were Victorian masterpieces of brutality. We're talking about rest cures that involved weeks of bed rest, forced feedings, and sometimes, why not, electroshock therapy. Got postpartum depression? Congratulations, you're being locked in a sanatorium until you're either cured or forgotten. And no, you don't get a refund. So here's the terrifying truth. Victorian medicine was a bit like trying to fix a broken clock with a hammer. Occasionally it worked. More often, it left you with fewer gears and no idea what time it was. And yet, people had faith. Not because it made sense, but because it was something. When you're desperate, even a man in a blood-soaked apron starts to look like a beacon of hope. Which brings us back to our friends in the marshes. All those barefoot women and kids weren't wading through cold slime for fun. They were part of a massive, miserable, bleeding-edge medical ecosystem. A leech, once plucked off a girl's ankle, could end up on the chest of a parliamentarian. A doctor would nod, solemnly proclaim, "bad blood," and slap the parasite on like a wet sticker of healing. And that's the kicker. This wasn't fringe. This was mainstream. The rich, the royal, the respected, they were all in on it. Queen Victoria herself reportedly approved of bleeding therapies, because when everyone around you is coughing blood and passing out from mystery fevers, anything that seems medical starts to feel like salvation. But it does make you wonder, how many people died from the cure instead of the disease? Let that question linger, because next we're crawling into the soot-blackened world of another essential worker. One even smaller, sadder, and sootier than the leech collectors. It's still dark out. You're 7 years old. Your breakfast, if you had one, was a chunk of stale bread and the gentle encouragement of a boot nudging your ribs. Congratulations, you're a chimney sweep in Victorian England. Hope you like soot in your lungs, knees rubbed raw, and the knowledge that you're technically flammable now. This chapter isn't about metaphors. It's about actual children shoved into actual chimneys to clean them from the inside. Not with tools, not with long brushes or industrial vacuums, with their bodies. Picture a narrow, winding chimney flue, roughly 9 inches wide in some spots, pitch black, soot-choked, with jagged bricks that claw at your elbows every time you shift. Now imagine crawling up that thing like a desperate insect, no shoes, no mask, and no real sense of how or when you'll get out. Sound horrifying? Cool. That was the point. The Industrial Revolution created a smoke problem. More homes, more chimneys, more fire hazards. Enter the master sweeps, grown men with brooms and a business model that hinged on shoving children up vertical death tunnels. They needed boys small enough to fit into chimneys and poor enough that they couldn't say no. Which, in Victorian England, was most of them. Parents, desperate, jobless, or just done parenting, would sell their children to chimney masters in exchange for a few coins, or some vague promise of food. Once purchased, the child became property. Legally, morally, don't worry about it. Victorians didn't. The master would house them, and by house I mean cram them in an attic with straw, rats and other soot-covered child employees, and feed them just enough to keep their arms moving. Morning came early. The work began before dawn, because people didn't want to see or hear the soot children inside their walls. At sunrise, you'd already be halfway up someone's chimney, scraping away carbon buildup with your bare hands and face. The flues twisted unpredictably, narrowing and turning without warning. Sometimes you got stuck, sometimes you suffocated, and sometimes, if you were very unlucky, the fire had only been out for a few hours, and the bricks were still warm enough to blister your skin. And what did you get in return? A place to sleep, maybe, a scrap of bread, and the sweet, lung-blistering kiss of creosote. Children would cough for hours after every climb, hacking up black phlegm and blood. The Victorian diagnosis? A touch of the soot, The modern one, probably acute respiratory failure with a side of permanent damage. Let that sink in. These were 5, 6, 7-year-olds not even old enough to write their names, being jammed into vertical crawl spaces, filled with toxic dust, because adults didn't want to get their clothes dirty. And the kicker? These kids were called apprentices. That's right. The same term you'd use for a promising young blacksmith or an eager violin student, as if crawling through a carcinogenic hellscape was a trade to be mastered, not a punishment invented by chimney-loving demons. The day didn't end when the last chimney was clean. If you were slow or got stuck too often, your master might encourage you with a lit candle beneath your feet, a little hot wax on the soles to speed things up. Character building, they called it. Motivation, they said. Because nothing says workplace productivity like mild torture. And if you died, well, that was inconvenient. Not tragic, just bad for business. Sometimes a sweep would get wedged inside a flue and never make it out. The next day, they'd send in another child to try and dislodge the corpse. Very efficient, very cost-effective, very Victorian. But here's where the irony burns. Hotter than any hearth. All this labor, all this child sacrifice, was in service of comfort. Chimneys had to be clean so the upper and middle classes could sip tea by a tidy fire. The suffering of the sweep was invisible, filtered out with the smoke. If they were noticed at all, it was as grimy urchins who deserved their station, born into soot, bound to it by fate and class. Some sweeps tried to run away. Others developed permanent deformities from years of climbing, twisted spines, joint pain, and a condition known charmingly as sootwort, a cancer of the scrotum caused by years of exposure to soot and poor hygiene. Yes, scrotum cancer, in children, but even then, people looked the other way, because chimney sweeps were essential, just not important. Eventually a few reformers grew a conscience. People like Lord Shaftesbury campaigned against child labour, and new laws trickled in, painfully slow, like molasses in a cold house. The 1840 Chimney Sweepers Act set an age limit, 10, as in, sorry Timmy, you're only 9. We'll have to wait until your next birthday to stuff you into a fireplace. But enforcement was a joke. Inspectors were rare, penalties were light, and the demand for cheap labour never wavered. For decades, children still climbed, still coughed, still died, all in service of the almighty hearth. It wasn't until the 1870s that child sweeps truly began to disappear, replaced by brushes, machines, and eventually, something resembling human decency, that the echoes of soot-slick hands and ash-blackened faces still haunt the brickwork of England's oldest homes. So next time you light a cosy fire or admire the architectural charm of a chimney stack, spare a thought for the real-life Oliver Twists who bled in the dark to keep it clean. They didn't write memoirs, they didn't get statues, but for decades they were the invisible scaffolding of Victorian domesticity, climbing, scraping, choking, and slowly vanishing into the soot. Now breathe, gently. Because the air we have now, clean, regulated, relatively child-free, was bought with lungs that never got to grow old. Picture it, midnight, London, sometime in the 1600s. Though honestly, this nightmare spans centuries. The city is asleep, mostly. The streets are quiet. The moon hangs heavy in the sky like it's judging you, which, fair, because you're about to spend the next 6 hours knee-deep in other people's digestive history. You are a gong farmer. And no, that doesn't mean you play ceremonial bells or practice mindfulness with monks. Gong was an Old English word for going, as in going to the privy. So naturally, a gong farmer is someone who harvests what gets left behind. Sound awful? It was. It's the reason people still use crappy job without irony. See, long before plumbing became standard issue and toilets stopped being a privilege of kings, humans did what humans do. They pooped. Every day. In chamber pots, cesspits, outhouses, buckets, and all that bodily bounty had to go somewhere, preferably not just into the street, though. Let's be honest, it often did. Enter the gong farmer, that brave and frequently nose-blind soul whose job was to collect, carry, and dispose of human waste under cover of darkness. Why at night? Because people didn't want to see where their waste went. Out of sight, out of nostrils. Let's talk logistics. Most homes had privies, little rooms tucked away out back, or, if you were fancy, inside the house. like a horrible closet that smelled of failure. These privies emptied into cesspits, which filled up over time with everything you can imagine: feces, urine, dead rats, hair clumps, the occasional pair of despair-flavored socks. When the pit filled, you didn't call a plumber, you called a gong farmer. The gong farmer would show up with a crew, armed with buckets, shovels, and something resembling a will to live. They would descend into the cesspit, literally climb down into it, and start digging. Carefully, because cesspits could collapse, releasing a tidal wave of fermented nightmares that sometimes killed people. Yes, you could drown in sewage, and some did. Let that visual marinate for a second. Now imagine this process happening all night long. The gong farmer would fill a series of buckets, haul them up on ropes, and then load the contents into carts. Covered carts, if they were generous. Open carts, if they were realistic. Then came the delightful part, the disposal. Gong farmers had to find places to dump the waste, usually on the outskirts of the city or in designated lay stalls, which is a charming old word for poop pile. And what did this noble occupation pay? Actually, not terrible. In fact, being a gong farmer was one of the better paid manual jobs in Tudor and early Victorian England. Why? Because nobody wanted to do it. Supply and demand, but for human excrement. The stench was horrific. The clothing was ruined. Your social life, non-existent. But if you were poor and didn't mind smelling like the death of a sewer pipe, you could make a living. There were some hazards. Besides drowning in filth, which should be hazard enough, thank you, gong farmers risked disease, particularly cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Protective gear wasn't really a thing. The best you could hope for was leather trousers and maybe a rag soaked in vinegar tied around your nose. So basically cosplay for a sad skunk, and forget about hand washing. Most gong farmers didn't have access to running water. Their hands, boots, and clothing absorbed the stench like an emotional tattoo. It stayed with them in their skin, in their homes, in their sleep. Even after washing, the smell clung like regret. Socially, gong farmers lived on the edge. People needed them, but no one wanted to be near them. They were banned from public gatherings, often made to live outside city walls, and treated like disease vectors, which again, not entirely unfair. Their job was essential, but their presence was a reminder of what people wanted to forget, that even the wealthy were just temporarily clean. And yet, for centuries, cities depended on them. London, Paris, Rome, all the great centers of civilization, were, at their core, managed by people who hauled human waste by the ton. Without them, streets would have flooded with filth faster than any revolution. In fact, one of the worst sanitation disasters in British history, the Great Stink of 1858, happened precisely because the waste disposal system broke down, and raw sewage literally baked in the summer sun, until Parliament had to evacuate. True story. But back to the gong farmers. Occasionally they'd make a grim discovery. Cesspits weren't always full of just waste. Sometimes people used them to hide secrets, aborted fetuses, murdered infants, even weapons. There are records of farmers finding bones, rings, and other items that made the job even more horrifying than advertised. Nothing says bonus shift like human remains bubbling to the surface while you're ankle deep in liquefied shame. And if you think the job got easier over time, sweet summer child. Even as indoor plumbing emerged, many poorer areas still relied on bucket toilets well into the 19th century. In cities you had nightmen, the Victorian cousins of gong farmers, who collected the night soil in pails and wheeled it away before sunrise. We'll meet them again soon. There's something tragically poetic about it all. The society builds churches, palaces, and museums, and beneath it all, quietly keeping the gears turning, are the men with shovels full of crap. No medals, no titles, just the knowledge that without them, civilization quite literally falls apart at the seams. So next time you flush a toilet, light a scented candle, or complain about taking the garbage out, remember, your ancestors had to shovel it out, carry it down the street, and pray it didn't spill on the way to the dump site. And for that, someone got paid in shillings and lost the ability to smell joy. Now breathe in through the nose, and maybe immediately regret it. Let's turn the lights on, gently, and enter the flickering, sulphur-scented world of the Victorian match factory. It's not romantic. It's not whimsical. It's industrial-scale misery, set to the glow of toxic death. Welcome to the life of the matchstick girl. Imagine walking into a factory before sunrise. You're 13, maybe younger. Your dress is second-hand. Your lungs are already coughing before you clock in. And your shift, 14 hours, give or take. There's a faint chemical haze in the air, like rotten garlic mixed with hope. And your job is to dip wooden splints into a paste made from white phosphorus, a substance so dangerous it could literally melt your face off. And spoiler, it sometimes did. They called it Fossy Jaw. Sounds like a charming pet name, right? It wasn't. It was short for phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. A truly delightful occupational hazard where the bones of your face slowly die while you're still using them. It started with a toothache, then a swelling, then a strange, sickly glow under your skin. Your jaw literally lighting up like some grim Victorian nightlight. Then came the pus, the smell, the open sores, and eventually, if you were lucky, the doctors amputated the bone. If you weren't lucky, the phosphorus leached into your skull and killed you. Let that linger like the stench of open wounds and sulfur. The factories knew about the danger. They didn't care. White phosphorus was cheap, efficient, and made matches that struck easily, which made it the darling of the match industry. Safer alternatives existed. Red phosphorus, for instance. But switching would cost money, and if there's one thing more enduring than a Victorian disease, it's corporate greed. So who bore the cost? Poor women and girls, mostly. The match girls, as they were called, were the invisible engine of this profit machine. They sat for hours on backless stools, dipping, drying, bundling. Their fingers cracked and burned. Their eyes stung. Their skin absorbed the poison through contact, breath, and proximity. And when they got sick, they were replaced. There was always another girl waiting. The pay? Miserable. Wages were docked for talking, sneezing, or dropping a single matchstick. Bring your own glue. Bring your own brush. If you didn't, more docked wages. It was a system engineered to trap the desperate, and it worked brilliantly. And still, somehow, these girls endured. Some of them even fought back. In 1888, a group of match girls working at the Bryant and May factory in London did the unthinkable. They went on strike. They had no union, no legal protection. Most of them couldn't even read. But they were tired of bleeding gums and yellow teeth, and the ever-present threat of glowing death, so they walked out. Hundreds of them, into the street, arms linked, faces defiant, jaws mostly intact. For now, the public was shocked. Children? Striking? It forced the newspapers to pay attention. Journalists started reporting on conditions inside the factories. One article described the match girls as half-starved, ill-clad, and overworked. Suddenly, society had to look at the people it had been ignoring, and it did not like what it saw. The strike lasted weeks. The factory owners caved, not because they grew hearts, but because they feared bad press and empty pockets. The girls won better pay, fewer fines, and eventually, safer working conditions. And while white phosphorus wouldn't be banned in Britain until 1910, yes, 1910, the match girls lit a spark, not just in their factory, but across the labour movement. Let's pause there, because in this nightmare of glowing jaws and corporate indifference, something genuinely powerful happened. These girls, some barely old enough to vote if women could have voted, stared down a factory system that tried to silence them and won. It wasn't clean, it wasn't easy, but it mattered, and in a century that mostly measured women by their silence, they chose noise. Still, for many, it came too late. We don't know all their names. Medical records from the time are vague at best, and factory logs didn't bother listing workers who died, but the symptoms live on in Victorian medical journals. Faces collapsing inward, jawbones removed without anesthesia, girls who glowed faintly in the dark before fading forever. And there was no compensation, no pensions, no social media outrage, just the slow rot of justice never served. So next time you light a match, assuming you still use them and aren't fully committed to the disposable lighter lifestyle, remember what that flicker used to cost. Not just in labour, but in the lives of girls named Sarah, or Annie, or Elsie, whose final smiles may have glowed, but only because their bones were dying. They didn't get statues. They didn't get marble plaques or heroic poems. But they got attention. Eventually. And in the world of the exploited, that's sometimes the biggest miracle of all. So yeah, let that burn slow. Imagine this. It's a damp London night in 1828. The fog is thick, clinging to your clothes like guilt. You've got a shovel, a lantern, and a partner named Scrapey Joe. And no, that's not a nickname you gave him. It's what's on his business card. You're not here to mourn the dead. You're here to borrow them. Temporarily, for educational purposes, of course. You're a resurrectionist, the Victorian answer to a supply chain problem. So horrifying it makes Amazon look like a nunnery. Let's rewind. In the early 1800s, medical schools were booming. Science was finally inching away from the four humours, and doctors were desperate to learn anatomy by cutting open real human bodies. Minor issue. It was illegal to just go around slicing into people. The only corpses legally allowed for dissection were those of executed criminals. And, surprise, there weren't enough of them. Apparently even murderers had gone soft. So what did the noble medical establishment do? Did they advocate for ethical body donation? Of course not. They created a black market corpse economy. Surgeons turned a blind eye, and resurrectionists, also known as body snatchers, got to work. Grave robbing became a growth industry. Literally. These were not your cartoonish ghouls in capes and lightning. These were men in waistcoats, armed with rope, chisels, and an intimate understanding of coffin design. Their process was surgical. First, they'd bribe the local gravedigger for information. Who got buried where, how deep, how fresh. Then, under cover of darkness, they'd dig only at the head of the grave, crack open the coffin, and use a hook to yank the body out by the neck. Why not take the whole coffin? Too heavy, too obvious. The body was the asset, the wood was just overhead. And no, they didn't want your clothes. In fact, removing a corpse's clothing before selling it made it technically not theft. Because under British law, a body wasn't property. But clothes? Oh, those had value. So they stripped the dead, left the garments behind like a grim little gift, and carted off the naked remains to eager doctors who paid by the pound. Let that legal loophole marinate for a moment. Some resurrectionists got enthusiastic. In Edinburgh, two charming gentlemen named William Burke and William Hare decided to skip the digging altogether. Instead of waiting for people to die naturally, so slow, so boring, they started killing lodgers and selling the bodies. 18 victims later, someone noticed that this particular boarding house had the turnover rate of a cursed hotel. Burke was caught, tried and hanged. Hare testified against him and vanished, but the phrase burking, meaning to smother someone for medical resale, lived on in glorious infamy. The public, as you might imagine, was not thrilled. Families started watching over fresh graves in shifts. Coffins were secured with iron bars called mort safes. Cemeteries hired armed guards, some even installed tripwire-triggered flares, turning the act of grave robbing into something dangerously close to a Scooby-Doo episode with real consequences. But the resurrectionists kept working, because the money was good, disgustingly good. A single corpse could fetch up to 10 guineas, more than a month's wages for many. And when you're poor, hungry and morally flexible, digging up dead strangers starts to sound like a retirement plan. The surgeons, meanwhile, perfected their poker faces. Technically, they weren't asking for stolen bodies, they just left the back door open and happened to have cash ready. If a suspiciously fresh cadaver appeared on the slab at 2 a.m, well, that was none of their business. Their job was to educate. Yours was to not ask questions. There's something grimly elegant about it. A corpse economy driven by progress and denial. Society wanted medical advancement, but without the mess, so it pushed the mess underground, into the hands of people with spades and no bedtime. Doctors sliced. Students learned in the shadows. Someone else dug the hole. It gets darker. Some resurrectionists didn't wait for the grave at all. In cases of poverty, plague, or accident, bodies could be taken from hospitals, morgues, or even the river. There are accounts of poorhouses losing track of their dead, or of hospital attendants being paid off to look the other way. In some cities, the line between undertaker and supplier got dangerously blurry. Eventually, the public lost it. Riots broke out near medical schools. Surgeons were threatened, attacked, occasionally chased through the streets by mobs wielding pitchforks and righteous outrage. It was chaos, and still, the demand for bodies didn't stop. Finally, in 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed. It allowed unclaimed bodies from hospitals and workhouses to be used for science. No consent required. Just die in poverty. And congratulations, you've donated your body to medical advancement by default. The law was hailed as a victory. Surgeons got their corpses. Resurrectionists went out of business. Graveyards got a little sleep. But let's not pretend it was altruism. The act didn't fix the problem. It just shifted it. Now, the poor couldn't even die with dignity. They became raw material, absorbed into the educational machine. Silent, anonymous, dissected, and discarded. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the knowledge that much of modern medicine, the good stuff, the real science, is built on a foundation of stolen bodies, of graves dug in the dark, of moral compromises wrapped in linen? Maybe we remember the resurrectionists, not as heroes, not even as villains, but as symptoms. Symptoms of a society that wanted progress but didn't want to pay for it. The society that asked the dead to make one final sacrifice, without asking at all. So sleep tight tonight. And if you feel the ground shifting beneath you, well, it's probably just history digging something else up. Let's take a break from dead bodies and return to something equally lifeless, but significantly squishier: dog poop. That's right, we're diving headfirst into the very specific, very real career of the Victorian pure finder, a job title that sounds oddly wholesome until you realize pure is just a charming euphemism for canine excrement. And no, this isn't some isolated weird job of the week footnote in history. This was an actual, semi-respected profession in 19th century England. These weren't pranksters or eccentrics. These were workers, people, citizens, with buckets. Let's set the scene. You're in London, grey, crowded, and paved in filth. There's no real sewer system yet. Streets double as garbage heaps. And dogs? Dogs are everywhere. Not pampered lapdogs in sweaters, but strays. Working animals. Factory mutts. Alley beasts. All of them producing an endless supply of brown gold, or, as tanners like to call it, pure. See, tanning leather is a nasty business. You have to strip hair, soften the hide, and somehow remove that recently alive aroma. Enter dog poo. It turns out that enzymes in dog feces help break down tough collagen fibers, making the leather more supple and manageable. And because nothing says progress like using turds as an industrial solvent, tanneries in Victorian England started buying it regularly, in bulk. Thus, the pure finder was born. Their job was simple: roam the streets, find fresh dog droppings, and collect them in a bucket. No gloves, no tongs, just a sharp eye, a strong stomach, and a soul that had long since given up hope. Once the bucket was full, or full enough that the smell turned into a living thing, they'd haul it over to the local tannery, trade it for a few pence, and then head back out for another round. It was hard, thankless work, and yet, strangely, pure finders held a curious position in society. They weren't beggars, they weren't criminals, they were tolerated. Essential, even. Tanneries needed them. The leather industry needed them. The economy needed them, which is a poetic way of saying that people were paid to carry poop for capitalism. Now let's pause and consider the logistics. Finding dog poop in Victorian London wasn't exactly difficult. The place was an open-air compost bin, but collecting it? That took skill. Not just any dropping would do, it had to be the right consistency, too old and dry, and it was worthless. Too fresh, and it was a health risk. So pure finders became in a way connoisseurs. They could eyeball a pavement pile and know immediately if it was worth scooping. It's disgusting, it's depressing, it's oddly impressive. But the job came with risks. Not just disease, which was a constant companion, but also theft. Yes, theft. A bucket of pure had value, and there were cases of rival collectors swiping each other's haul. You'd think the last thing anyone would steal is a sloshing container of street poop, but welcome to the Victorian economy. It was cutthroat, and apparently cut bucket too. Socially, pure finders walked the tightrope of public perception. They were visible but invisible. Everyone knew what they did, but no one really looked at them. Children laughed. Adults held their noses, and yet, when the leather shoes had to be made or the belts had to be tanned, someone always came knocking. Let that irony sink in. You could buy a pair of expensive gloves made from soft leather, and never know that it was brought to perfection by the back alley scavenger, with a bucket of canine regrets. There's also something strangely tragic about the whole enterprise. Many pure finders were elderly, too old for factory work, too poor to retire, they turned to the one job no one else wanted. There are records of widows in their 60s, stooping over cobblestones with a broken ladle and a burlap sack, just trying to earn enough to eat. It's not even Dickensian. Dickens wouldn't have touched this, to believe. And like many jobs of the Victorian underclass, there was no upward mobility. You didn't graduate from pure finding to street sweeping. You just aged into irrelevance. Your knees went, your back gave out, and when you couldn't carry the bucket anymore, someone younger or hungrier took your place. There was no pension, no safety net, just the slow realization that you'd spent a lifetime handling the waste of creatures with better lives than you. Eventually, as sanitation improved and the leather industry modernized, the profession began to die off. Public health campaigns pushed for cleaner streets, dog taxis reduced stray populations, and factories started using chemicals instead of excrement. The pure finders disappeared, not with a bang, but with a sigh. Their work forgotten, their buckets empty, their history flushed away like so much of what they once carried. And yet, they were real, essential. People who worked jobs that most wouldn't dream of, not because they loved it, but because they had to, because the economy, in its infinite wisdom, found a way to monetize shame and turn filth into product. So next time you tie your shoelaces, or throw on a leather belt, spare a quiet nod to the pure finders, the invisible hands behind the polished surface. They worked in the shadows, among the droppings, so that someone else could walk comfortably through a cleaner world. And if you think that's the worst Victorian job imaginable, just wait. We're going matchmaking next, and trust me, there are fewer dog turds, but a whole lot more emotional damage. Matchmaking. The word probably conjures up images of romantic strolls, starry-eyed glances, and well-meaning old ladies with a talent for setting up compatible hearts. Well, throw that image out the nearest window and into a muddy 19th century street. Because in Victorian England, matchmaking wasn't about love, it was about livestock, human livestock, with better handwriting. Welcome to the grim transactional world of the Victorian matchmaker, where love was optional, dowries were essential, and your worth as a human being was calculated in acreage, breeding potential, and whether or not your father had connections. Spoiler, feelings didn't make the final cut. Let's start with the basics. If you were born into the middle or upper class in the 1800s, congratulations, your life was now a series of auditions for marriage. If you were a woman, this meant debutante balls, corsets designed by sadists, and the constant awareness that your youth was a ticking clock. If you were a man, you needed money, land, a surname that didn't sound like it came from a butcher shop, and ideally, a complete set of teeth. And standing between you and potential matrimony was the matchmaker. Not a fairy godmother, but more like an unpaid LinkedIn algorithm, wearing lace gloves. These were often women, usually widows or socialites, who knew everyone and had no qualms about ranking humans like racehorses. Their role was to broker deals, romantic deals, yes, but mostly economic ones. They tracked who was eligible, who was rich, who was pretty, and who was desperate. In many cases they weren't even hired by families, they just inserted themselves into the process, like well-dressed parasites who believed strongly in arranged capitalism. Now if you think this matchmaking industry was reserved for dukes and duchesses, think again. Even lower middle-class families participated. The goal wasn't status, it was survival. A good match meant your daughter wouldn't end up scrubbing floors. A great match meant your entire family got a social upgrade. And a bad match, well, that's what spinsterhood was for. Let's pause on that word. Spinster. In Victorian England, this was not just an insult, it was a sentence. If you weren't married by 25, society quietly moved your seat at dinner further away from the fire. By 30, you were considered a failed product. By 40, you might as well be a ghost. Except ghosts were often invited to more social events. The matchmaker's job was to prevent this fate by any means necessary. They'd arrange meetings, orchestrate chance encounters at public gardens, and whisper behind fans at parties with the strategic precision of a chess grandmaster. Lady Charlotte is quite accomplished, they'd murmur, which was Victorian for, she plays piano and hasn't said anything political in public. Meanwhile, Mr. Pembroke is very steady, meant he was rich, emotionally constipated, and likely to die early enough for a decent inheritance. If a match was made, great. If not, the matchmaker moved on. No refunds, no apologies, just another corseted soul shoved back into the parlor to practice smiling like her future depended on it. Because it did. And let's not forget the pressure on the men. Sure, they had more freedom, but they were still expected to marry well. A gentleman who picked a wife without consulting his family or social network risked being ostracized, marrying beneath you. Even if it was for something insane like love, was social suicide. And if you were poor, good luck. The idea of marrying for fuck it only really worked in novels and tragic operas. In reality, you needed assets, not passion. Your estate was the bouquet, your bank account, a love letter. It's hard to overstate how thoroughly this system stripped the humanity out of intimacy. Marriage was less about compatibility and more about merging assets, consolidating land, and making sure the next generation came out with a chin that looked sufficiently aristocratic. And yet, people still hoped. Women pinned flowers to their gowns and prayed their suitor wouldn't be a balding muzzer with a sweaty handshake. Men adjusted their cravats and hoped their future bride had a personality, or at least wasn't fluent in sarcasm. Spoiler, she was. But she couldn't say so. There were, of course, exceptions. Stories of love matches that triumphed over expectations, secret elopements, and heart-fluttering letters exchanged under candlelight. But these were the exception, not the rule. For most, marriage wasn't a journey of the heart, it was a transaction of survival. And the matchmakers? They were the brokers, the agents, the flesh and blood spreadsheets trying to align two families' profit margins. Some were kind, some were cunning, most were both, but all operated within a system where feelings were a luxury, not a requirement. So next time you see a period drama and swoon at the ball scenes, remember, every dance was also a job interview, every laugh was carefully rehearsed, every potential match came with an invisible scroll of expectations and debt calculations. It wasn't just about love, it was about alliances, stability, optics, and if you failed, there was no swiping left, no dating apps, no second chance in another town, just a lifetime of embroidery and polite smiles at weddings that weren't yours. The matchmaker moved on, the world moved on, and you? You kept pretending it was fine, so breathe that in, lace and all. And now that we've dealt with courtship as capitalism, let's head underground, literally. Because the next profession makes matchmaking look like spa work. We're going into the sewers. Welcome to the underworld, and not in the fun, mythological, maybe Hades is hot kind of way. We're talking about the actual literal underworld of Victorian London, the sewers. Now if you've ever complained about traffic, office chairs or fluorescent lighting, please meet the Toshers, the men who made their living wading through rivers of human waste, broken dreams, and occasionally dead animals. Toshers were sewer scavengers. Their job was to descend into London's vast damp intestinal tract and search for anything remotely valuable. Coins, bits of jewelry, scrap metal, lost buttons, dropped spoons, and sometimes bones. Yes, bones. People dropped things, things got flushed, and the Toshers were there to collect the leftovers of a city too distracted to notice what it lost. Let's be very clear, this was not a quirky side gig. There were no safety vests, no gloves, and definitely no union. The Victorian sewer system, especially before the grand overhaul in the 1860s, was a chaotic blend of old rivers, brick tunnels, and newer drains. A Frankenstein's monster of excremental engineering. And into this maze went the Toshers, armed with nothing more than a lantern, a rake, a canvas sack, and an extremely relaxed relationship with personal hygiene. Work started before dawn. Why? Because it was illegal. Technically, toshing was a crime. Unauthorized entry into the sewers was forbidden, mainly because people kept dying down there and it looked bad in the papers. So Toshers went in early, climbed down manholes in alleys or riverbanks, and hoped for a good haul before the city above even had its tea. And what greeted them below? Darkness for one. The kind of dark that swallows sound. The smell, oh, the smell, was beyond description. Imagine every bad decision humanity ever made, fermented and reduced into a damp fog. Add rats, thousands of them, the big ones, the bold ones, the kind that make eye contact. The water, depending on the day, could range from ankle-deep sludge to waist-high horror soup. You didn't so much wade as surrender. Every step was a gamble. There were sudden drops, crumbling bricks, pockets of gas that could knock you unconscious or explode. Methane doesn't care about your dreams. And then there were the floods. Sudden rainstorms could turn a calm tunnel into a raging torrent in minutes. Toshas were known to drown just feet from the exit, pulled under by the same current that might deliver a nice silver brooch an hour earlier. All part of the gamble. But for those who survived, there was money. Not much, but enough. A good day's haul could include a coin or two, maybe a spoon or discarded tools from a careless plumber. The occasional ring, likely flushed in rage or lost during some unfortunate bathroom crisis, was like winning the lottery. Scrap metal was weighed and sold. Bones could be sold to glue factories. Rags fetched a penny per pound. The sewer was one giant, putrid treasure chest. And there was pride. Oddly enough, Toshas were poor. Yes, but they were also self-employed. They didn't answer to a boss. They didn't beg. They worked. Dirty work. Dangerous work. But honest. In its own grotesque way. Some even passed the trade down through generations, teaching their sons how to spot valuable debris in the filth, how to listen for distant water, how to tell a gas pocket from a dead end. Let that sink in. Your family legacy isn't a crest or a country estate. It's the skill of feeling through knee-high sewage to find a copper penny. And they had their own uniform. Sort of. Old clothes, heavily patched, often waxed to repel moisture. Tall boots if you were lucky, bare feet if you weren't. A belt full of tools, hooks, rags, sometimes even a small cudgel for the rats. Lanterns were crucial. You strapped it to your chest or helmet, if you had one, and prayed it didn't go out mid-tunnel, because if it did, you were blind, alone, and very possibly lost beneath the city. The public, of course, barely acknowledged them. If they were mentioned at all, it was with mild disgust or curiosity. A Tosha might surface from a manhole, covered in God knows what, and people would cross the street without looking. But still, they were part of the city's circulatory system, unseen, essential, and utterly expendable. Eventually, the Great Stink of 1858, yes, that was a real event name, forced the government to modernize London's sewers. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette built a new system, grand, efficient, relatively rat-free, and while it was a miracle of civil engineering, it also signaled the end for many Toshas. Access became restricted, security increased. The sewers were no longer an open market of filth and opportunity. They became institutionalized, patrolled, controlled. Toshas faded into history. Their stories, if told at all, were kept in footnotes, memoirs, and the occasional journal entry. No monuments, no medals, just a quiet disappearance absorbed back into the city's underbelly, like everything else they'd once fished out. So next time your sink clogs, and a plumber shows up with a smile, consider the alternative. Consider the man who used to slide into darkness every morning, hoping for a lost coin, dodging rats and tides and silence. Consider the Tosha, grimy, brave, and perhaps the only treasure in the tunnels. And remember, the Victorian underclass didn't just suffer in the daylight, they suffered in the dark too, under your feet, under your streets, scraping a living from the city's filth. Coming up next, we're staying muddy, but shifting focus. Because while Toshas dealt with sewers, there was another group knee-deep in silt and despair, the mudlarks. Child labour, toxic sludge, and buttons. Lots of buttons. It's low tide on the River Thames, sometime around 1850. The city is barely waking up. Smokestacks cough soot into the dawn. Traders shout, carts rattle, and fishmongers set up shop with yesterday's regrets. And then, just below the bustling riverbanks, in the slick, grey underworld of glistening mud, you see them, children, dozens of them, scattered like crows on a carcass, scraping, sifting, sinking. These are the mudlarks. London's youngest, dirtiest, and most expendable workforce. To call it a job is generous. Mudlarking wasn't formal employment. It was desperation with a tide chart. The mudlarks, often children, sometimes elderly, occasionally just human-shaped shadows, foraged through the thick banks of the Thames, in search of anything that might be worth something to someone, somewhere. Nails, coins, rope, rags, bones, broken tools, bits of iron, pins, shoes, and if luck was feeling kind, the odd piece of jewellery. Imagine being 8 years old, barefoot, and up to your knees in a mix of river water, industrial waste, animal remains, and Victorian guilt. You're cold, you're soaked, and you're trying to decide whether the rusty object in your hand is a bent spoon or just another tetanus delivery system. Either way, you pocket it. There was no equipment, no supervision, no safety protocol. The uniform was rags. The wage was whatever you find. The work began at dawn and ended when the tide rolled back in, or your fingers went numb, whichever came first. The river itself was an unpredictable beast. In dry months, it exposed more mud. In flood season, it swallowed whole piers. But the filth, that was constant. The Thames was a dump. Not metaphorically, literally. Human waste, factory runoff, slaughterhouse refuse, and the entire city's garbage drained directly into it. Swimming was suicide. Wading was work. And somehow, the mudlarks thrived in it. Not in the healthy and fulfilled sense, of course. No one was thriving in Victorian poverty, but some children became experts in the river's moods. Learning to read the currents, the exposed pilings, the slope of the banks. They knew where small items washed up, where sailors lost coins, where rich idiots dropped valuables while puking over a railing. Let that image settle in. A child, barely tall enough to reach your elbow, scavenging at your feet while you complain about the smell and fumble your pocket watch into the tide. They hear the plop. They remember. They come back tomorrow. And all for what? A handful of farthings if they were lucky. A crust of bread. A cold potato. Most didn't work alone. They sold their findings to rag-and-bone men who acted as middlemen, and offered, shall we say, flexible pricing. A day's worth of cuts, bruises and infections might fetch just enough to not starve. But mudlarking wasn't just poverty's last resort. It was also a kind of urban folklore. Tourists wrote about them, journalists pitied them, novelists borrowed them as Dickensian decor. They became symbols, tragic, grimy, oddly romantic in the way that people sometimes romanticize misery from a safe distance. And still, they kept working. The river gave and took. It gave spoils but took health. Skin diseases were common, respiratory infections constant, cuts from broken glass, sharp shells, and rusted nails often became festering, limb-threatening wounds. Some mudlarks limped for life. Some didn't live long enough to limp. And yet, there was a strange pride in it. Mudlarks were streetwise. They knew the secrets of the river. They were self-employed, if such a term can be stretched over child labor like a threadbare coat. They weren't pickpockets. They weren't beggars. They earned what they took from the muck. And perhaps that's the saddest part. In a city obsessed with industry, refinement and empire, some of its youngest citizens spent their lives hunched in a toxic soup, finding value in the things others lost. They lived on the edge of the river, of society, of survival, and were largely ignored unless a reporter needed a headline. Occasionally stories surfaced of a mudlark finding treasure, a silver brooch, a gold ring, a military medal, but even those moments were bittersweet. A child might trade a royal heirloom for a loaf of bread. They had no way to authenticate value, no time to haggle. Hunger erases negotiation. By the late 19th century, as sanitation improved and laws regulating child labor tightened, slowly, reluctantly, inconsistently, the mudlarks began to disappear. Not in some dramatic final chapter, just gradually. The tide turned. The river got cleaner. The city moved on. But the ghosts remain. Today, legal mudlarking exists as a hobby, a quaint nod to the past. People comb the riverbanks with permits and metal detectors, posting their finds on Instagram. They marvel at clay pipes, old coins, bottle shards, fragments of Victorian life. What they rarely post about are the lives behind those fragments, the cold hands that first lifted them from the filth, the barefoot boy who hoped that button might mean dinner, the girl who pocketed nails while trying not to cry. So next time you walk along the Thames and feel charmed by its history, remember the children in the mud, not fictional ones, real ones, with names long forgotten, hands cracked by the cold, and eyes sharp from necessity. They didn't have hobbies. They had hunger. And now we're going even deeper, because if the mudlarks foraged the edges of the river, the next crew went door to door, not for food, but for feces. Night soil men, midnight collectors, heroes in the worst possible sense. It's midnight in Victorian London, and the city is finally quiet, save for the creak of a cartwheel, the muffled slosh of something viscous, and the sound of a man muttering curses under his breath as he wrestles a wooden bucket from beneath someone's privy. That's not oil, that's not water, that is something far more personal. Meet the night soil man, the least glamorous essential worker in human history. Before flushing toilets revolutionized the bathroom experience and blessed us with a world where we only occasionally think about plumbing, most Victorian homes relied on a different system. The bucket system, the cesspit system, the don't ask what's under the floorboard system. And when those buckets filled up, which they did regularly because humans are disgustingly efficient at waste production, someone had to come and take it all away. That someone was the night soil man. Now, let's be clear, this was not an aspirational job. No child dreamed of growing up and hauling buckets of human excrement through narrow alleys while the city slept. You didn't wear a badge. You didn't get a title. What you got was a cart, a shovel, a lantern, and a relationship with feces that was intimate. The process was as grim as it sounds. Under the cloak of darkness, night soil men would enter homes, or more commonly, the courtyards and outhouses behind them, and remove the waste containers that had been slowly fermenting all week. These were not dainty porcelain chamber pots. We're talking about full-sized wooden barrels, filled to the brim with the collective bowel stories of an entire household. The men carried these containers out, sometimes by hand, sometimes on crude sledges, often spilling their contents in the process. They'd load them onto horse-drawn carts and transport the goods to designated dumping sites, usually on the outskirts of the city, in fields specially chosen for their, shall we say, low real estate value. And then they'd go back and do it again, night after night, home after home. The cycle never stopped, because people never stopped eating. And as any night soil man could tell you, what goes in must, without exception, come out. The stench was legendary. It wasn't just bad. It wasn't just offensive. It was a full-body, spirit-crushing aroma that clung to your skin, your clothes, your memories. Some night soil men reportedly chewed strong herbs or smoked foul cigars just to numb their sense of smell. Others simply gave up and accepted that the stink would follow them to the grave and probably linger at the funeral. Let that sink in. You die, and people still remember you by the scent. Socially, they were pariahs. People crossed the street to avoid them. Landlords wouldn't rent to them. Their children were bullied. Their wives, if they had them, often lied about their husband's profession to avoid being shunned at the bakery. And yet, the work was vital. Without night soil men, the cities would have drowned in their own waste. Literally, in fact, many did, temporarily. The infamous Great Stink of 1858 occurred precisely because human waste overwhelmed London's primitive sewer system. The Thames turned into a reeking broth of urine, feces, and political inertia. Parliament had to suspend meetings because the smell was so unbearable. Lawmakers hung soaked handkerchiefs in front of their faces and begged someone, anyone, to fix it. That someone was Joseph Bazalgette, who built a revolutionary new sewer system that eventually put most night soil men out of business. But until then, they were the unacknowledged janitors of civilization. The job was physically punishing. These men lifted hundreds of pounds of waste each night, often up and down slippery stairs, through cramped alleys, and over cobblestone streets. Injuries were common. Back problems were guaranteed, and if you slipped, which you would, eventually, the consequences were not just painful, but revolting. And let's not forget disease. Before germ theory was widely accepted, people had no idea that human waste carried bacteria. Night soil men breathed in toxic vapors, suffered infections from even minor cuts, and frequently succumbed to illness. The irony, they were cleaning up the very waste that fueled epidemics, and dying from it anyway. Some tried to dress the job up. They called themselves sanitation operatives, or removers of noxious matter, but everyone knew what they were. Kids on the street had their own names. Poo cart boys, bucket haulers, the stink brigade. The euphemisms couldn't mask the reality. You were the man with the muck. The pay, to be fair, wasn't terrible. Not great, nothing in Victorian labour really was, but better than many other low-skill jobs. The reason? Because no one wanted it. Like our old friends the gong farmers and pure finders, night soil men were part of the economy's dirty secret. You could make a living if you were willing to touch what no one else would. They formed tight-knit crews, They worked in pairs or trios, rotating routes, sharing tips, helping each other through the worst nights, like during storms when everything turned into an ankle-deep river of sewage, or during holidays when people somehow produced more waste as if their intestines joined in the festivities. They had their own slang, their own roots, even their own territorial disputes. You didn't poach someone else's waste district without consequences. There are documented fights, actual brawls, over who got to clean which street. Think turf war, but smellier. Eventually, with the rise of modern sanitation, the night soil trade began to disappear. Indoor plumbing became more common. Sewers were expanded. Flush toilets, once a luxury, became the standard. By the end of the 19th century, most urban areas had phased out manual waste collection. But for decades, centuries, even night soil men were the backbone of a fragile system that depended on invisible labor. They kept the city livable, quietly, thanklessly, and with buckets. So next time you flush a toilet and marvel at how clean and simple it all seems, remember the men who came before, the ones who didn't get to press a button and walk away, the ones who walked through the darkest alleys at the darkest hour, hauling away what the world tried so hard to ignore. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Like, subscribe, or maybe just thank your toilet. Coming up next, we're leaving the waste behind. But don't get too comfortable, because now we're talking about death photography, where Victorians made mourning awkward, creepy, and absolutely photogenic. Victorians were obsessed with death, not in the edgy, eyeliner-heavy teenage poetry kind of way, but in the let's spend our entire cultural budget on mourning attire and elaborate funerals kind of way. Death wasn't just an event, it was a social performance, and no performance was complete without a photograph, even if the subject was less than lively. Welcome to the oddly intimate world of Victorian death photography, or as it was sometimes called, memento mori, Latin for remember you must die. Or more loosely translated, cheer up, you're next. It all began with the rise of daguerreotypes in the mid-19th century. Suddenly, photography was within reach of the middle class. No longer just for the aristocracy or ambitious birds who sat still for oil paintings. Now even average families could afford to immortalize themselves in grayscale. But here's the catch. Photography wasn't exactly fast. Early methods required long exposure times, meaning subjects had to sit perfectly still for several seconds or even minutes. Dead people, it turns out, are fantastic at that. So, in a beautifully macabre twist of economics and sentiment, families began hiring photographers to take portraits of their recently deceased loved ones. And not just simple coffin shots. We're talking full-blown staged scenes. The deceased would be dressed, posed, sometimes propped upright with special metal stands. Eyelids might be glued open. Cheeks were pinched for color. A book could be placed in their lap. Flowers in their hands. A sibling's arm carefully arranged around their shoulder. All in the name of memory. Because let's not forget, photography was rare. For many families, this was the only image they'd ever have of their loved one. You couldn't scroll through a phone and reminisce. You got one chance, one photo. So if the child died young, which many did, the family would dress them in their best clothes, comb their hair, and take a picture that said, "We loved them, we remember them, we froze them in time." To modern eyes, it can seem morbid, even grotesque. But to the Victorians, it was just another part of mourning. Death wasn't hidden. It lived in the parlor. It wore black for a year. It kept a hair locket in its pocket. And yes, it sat for a portrait. Now, let's talk technique. The photographers were professionals who had to work quickly, quietly, and often under emotionally charged circumstances. Bodies stiffened fast, eyes clouded, limbs had to be posed before rigor mortis set in. The goal wasn't to highlight death, it was to disguise it, to make the deceased look as lifelike as possible. Serene, peaceful, occasionally just slightly suspicious. Some photos were subtle, the deceased lying in bed, as if simply resting. Others were fully staged, with the corpse surrounded by living relatives, arranged to look like part of a family tableau. In some cases, they were the only person in focus, because they were the only one who didn't move during the exposure. There are haunting examples of parents sitting stiffly beside their dead child, both gazing into the camera, their grief contained in tight collars and tired eyes. And there are more unsettling ones. Whole families posed around a sibling who is clearly no longer participating, and yet there's a dignity to them. A strange, raw sincerity. A family saying this person mattered, this person existed. Let that linger. The idea that photography wasn't just about presence, but about proof. Because death was everywhere. Child mortality rates were high. Epidemics swept through cities. Industrial accidents were common. You could die from a bad tooth, or a good walk in the wrong fog. And in that world, where the line between alive and not was dangerously thin, preserving an image became an act of resistance, a way to say, we won't forget. And the market responded. There were whole studios specializing in post-mortem portraits. They advertised in newspapers, offered package deals. Some had traveling kits, ready to photograph the dead right where they lay. And of course there were props, chairs, backdrops, clothing, anything to create the illusion of normalcy in the most abnormal moment imaginable. But not everyone approved. As the 19th century wore on, and photography became more common, some began to see death photography as morbid, tasteless. The kind of thing respectable people whispered about but no longer commissioned. It fell out of fashion, gradually replaced by painted memorials, poems, and eventually the quiet disappearance of death from the domestic space entirely. But for a few decades it was normal. Expected even. And what it reveals isn't just a society obsessed with mourning, but a society trying desperately to hold on to something, anything in the face of constant loss. Because mourning was a full-time job. Widows wore black for up to 2 years. Letter writing followed strict etiquette. Children were taught how to grieve before they were taught to read. And when someone died, the household transformed. Mirrors were covered, clocks were stopped, curtains drawn, and into this solemn theatre stepped the photographer, camera in hand, ready to capture the most delicate performance of all. And yet, there's something strangely comforting about it. In a world without antibiotics, without modern medicine, without any real promise of longevity, the Victorians made peace with death by giving it a seat at the table. They didn't pretend it wasn't happening. They didn't Photoshop it away. They dressed it up, held its hand, and gave it a proper portrait. We can roll our eyes now, scoff at the sepia tones and stiff collars. But maybe we've lost something too. Maybe in our rush to sterilize grief, to hide away pain, to move on faster than our hearts are ready, we've forgotten how to sit with it, to honor it, to look it in the face. Literally. So next time you scroll past a photo and think, they don't look happy, just remember, the Victorians had photos where the subject didn't look happy because they were dead. And the family still framed it. Coming up next, we're staying in the land of grim institutions, but trading stillness for back-breaking labor. Because if death was a photo op, poverty was a punishment. Welcome to the workhouse. Welcome to the workhouse. The Victorian institution where dreams went to die, preferably quietly, and ideally before mealtime so the staff wouldn't have to waste rations. If you've ever complained about bureaucracy, bad food, or fluorescent lighting, just imagine all of that with tuberculosis and a gruel chaser. Because here, poverty wasn't a condition, it was a crime. And the sentence? Indefinite. Let's back up. In 1834, the British government passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, which was a beautifully bureaucratic way of saying, let's make being poor as unbearable as possible, so fewer people try it. The theory was simple. Outdoor relief, money or food given to the needy while they remained in their homes, was too generous. Clearly the working class was getting too comfortable starving in their own beds, so in came the workhouse, a prison with slightly more weeping and marginally less freedom. Here's how it worked. If you couldn't find work, or your family had fallen into ruin, or heaven forbid, you were a child with dead parents, you could apply for admission to the local workhouse. Upon arrival, you were stripped, washed, aggressively, and issued a uniform. Families were immediately separated, husbands from wives, mothers from children, because nothing motivates productivity like existential despair. Your new home was a combination of cold stone walls, iron beds, barred windows, and the constant aroma of institutional hopelessness. Privacy? None. Comfort? That was considered immoral. Even affection was discouraged. If you smiled too often, people got suspicious. And the food? Let's talk about the food. Meals were standardized, intentionally bland, and purposefully insufficient. Breakfast might be oat gruel. Lunch could be a slab of boiled meat, the kind of meat that made boots seem flavorful. Dinner? More gruel. Vegetables were rare. Salt was a luxury. If you had teeth going in, you probably didn't on the way out. Let that image settle. A hungry man, shivering in a queue, being handed a ladle of watery oats by a matron who believes eye contact is a gateway drug to joy. Work was mandatory. Not the kind of work that builds character or leads to promotion. No, this was pointless, crushing, soul-extracting labor, designed to keep you exhausted, and ideally, regretful. Breaking stones, picking oakum, that's separating old rope fibers by hand, in case you weren't feeling humbled enough. Women might sew, scrub, do laundry for the wealthier institutions. Children swept floors or carried coal. There was just the privilege of existing under a roof that judged you constantly. Medical care? Technically, yes. Most workhouses had infirmaries, but these were the Victorian equivalent of please die quickly so we can change the bedding. Conditions were appalling, doctors were overworked and underpaid, and many illnesses went untreated until they became fatal or highly contagious, whichever came first. Still, people came, because the alternative was starvation, or the street, or, more commonly, both. And there were rules. Oh, there were rules. Wake up at dawn. Beds must be made with military precision. No talking during meals. No loitering. No questions. Misbehavior earned punishment. Reduced rations. Solitary confinement, or worse, being sent to the refractory ward, which was basically a Victorian timeout for adults with added humiliation. But perhaps the cruelest part of the workhouse was the ideology behind it. These places weren't designed to help, they were designed to deter. The logic was that if conditions were bad enough, people would find a way not to end up there. The suffering wasn't a bug in the system, it was the system. Moral backbone through misery. Let that sink in. Suffering as strategy, hunger as deterrent, loneliness as policy. Children fared no better. Workhouse schools existed, but they were often overcrowded, underfunded, and overseen by staff more interested in discipline than development. Boys were trained for manual labor, girls for domestic service. Both were reminded daily that their existence was a burden, and that the outside world was not eager to welcome them. Occasionally, a benefactor would drop in, a bishop, a politician, some well-meaning philanthropist with a monocle and a limited attention span. They'd marvel at how tidy the place looked, say something condescending about industrious paupers, and leave without noticing the malnourished 12-year-old crying behind the coal shed. Reform did come. Eventually. Slowly. And only after decades of public criticism, investigative journalism, and a few very inconvenient death statistics. Charles Dickens helped. His depictions of workhouses in Oliver Twist and other novels showed the public just how grotesque these institutions were. Suddenly, "Please, sir, I want some more," didn't sound greedy, it sounded reasonable. By the early 20th century, the workhouse system began to collapse under the weight of its own inhumanity. New welfare systems were introduced. The idea of punishing people for being poor became, if not extinct, at least unfashionable, but the legacy lingers. The very architecture of these places was designed to oppress. Long corridors, echoing halls, windows placed too high to see out, and many of the old buildings still stand today, converted into flats or offices. You might even work in one, if you feel a cold breeze or an irrational urge to eat dry oats. Well, now you know why. So next time you think of poverty as something shameful or self-inflicted, remember the workhouse. Remember that entire generations were raised under a roof that told them, every single day, that they were failures. That comfort was a privilege. That love was a luxury. And yet, they survived. Because even within those walls, people found moments of resistance. A shared crust. A stolen smile. A whispered song after lights out. They weren't just statistics. They were stories. And we'd do well to remember them. Next up, we're trading institutional despair for handcrafted grief. Because nothing says "I miss you" like turning your dead loved one's hair into jewelry. Yes, real. Love. It comes in many forms. A letter, a kiss, a locket containing the hair of your dead grandmother braided into an intricate brooch and worn to every social function for the next decade. You know, classic Roman. Welcome to the Victorian tradition of mourning jewelry. And more specifically, corpse hair accessories. Because when emotions run high and refrigeration is non-existent, nothing says eternal devotion quite like weaving the physical remains of your loved ones into wearable art. Let's set the scene. It's the 1800s. Life expectancy is low. Plagues, accidents and illnesses are very much trending. Everyone you know is one bad cough or poorly cooked eel away from death. Mourning isn't a phase, it's a lifestyle. And just like every other Victorian obsession, it comes with rules, rituals, and fashion. Enter the hair jewelers, the niche artisans, who specialized in transforming clippings from the dead into elegant necklaces, bracelets, rings, and wall art. Yes, wall art. Entire wreaths made from braided and curled hair. Imagine a giant frame over your fireplace, filled not with oil-painted landscapes, but with the collective follicles of your family tree. Hair was ideal for this kind of thing. It didn't decay, it didn't smell, and it carried a tangible part of the person it once belonged to. A lock of mother's curls, a child's wispy strands, a soldier's dark shock of hair preserved before he shipped off to die in a trench. It was intimate, it was sacred, and depending on your taste, it was either deeply moving or wildly unsettling. Some pieces were subtle, a ring with a discreet twist of hair under glass. Others were intricate marvels, brooches shaped like flowers, the petals made from carefully stitched hair, looped and knotted into complex patterns. Some women kept their husband's hair on lockets that dangled from their necks like morbid pendants of fidelity. Others commissioned bracelets from an entire braid, clasped with engraved initials and lined with black jet beads. You weren't just keeping the memory alive, you were wearing it. Let that visual settle. A widow, dressed in full mourning black, sipping tea in a parlor decorated with curtains, made of crepe, and a corsage made from her dead baby's hair. And no one thought this was odd. Because it wasn't just socially acceptable, it was expected. Mourning had a schedule. Queen Victoria herself wore black for 40 years after Prince Albert's death, and helped elevate hair jewellery from personal to fashionable. If it was good enough for the monarch, it was good enough for middle-class sentimentality. Mourning became industrialized. You could even buy kits, DIY hair jewellery at home, because nothing spices up a Tuesday like meticulously threading Uncle Reginald's follicles into a wearable reminder that life is fleeting. The craftsmanship was astonishing. Victorian hairworkers developed entire manuals, pattern books that laid out hundreds of ways to curl, braid, loop, and knot hair into durable structures. They used special tools, tiny irons, curling rods, and woven molds. Hair had to be cleaned, treated, and often dyed to match a desired aesthetic. Some pieces contained hair from multiple people, a mother, a father, a sibling, all combined into one sentimental mosaic of mortality. Of course, not everyone waited until someone died. Pre-mortem hair jewellery was also a thing. Couples exchanged locks as tokens of love. Mothers kept hair from their children's first haircuts. People saved bits of their own hair in lockets for future remembrance. Because in Victorian England, nothing said "I'm thinking of you" like shipping your split ends through the postal service. Now here's where things get even more tangled. Fraud. With the rise in demand for mourning jewellery came a surge in mass production, and not all of it was authentic. Some jewellers, overwhelmed by demand, used generic human hair, sometimes imported in bulk from Europe, to complete orders faster. It wasn't technically illegal, but it was ethically fuzzy. Customers thought they were wearing Aunt Mildred's golden strands. In reality, it might have been Sven from Stockholm. Still, the emotional value persisted. People believed the hair was real, and in mourning, belief often outweighs biology. These keepsakes were tokens of memory. Grief you could touch, pain you could polish. But fashions change. By the early 20th century, mourning customs loosened. Hair jewellery fell out of vogue. Some blamed the rise of photography. Now, you could remember a face, not just a follicle. Others pointed to changing attitudes toward death. The 20th century brought war, mass death, and industrial funerals. Grief became more private, less ornate, more hidden. The hairpieces were tucked away into drawers, attics, or family trunks labeled "Do Not Open." Many were lost. Some were donated to museums. A few still surface at estate sales or vintage markets, usually accompanied by a buyer muttering, "Wait, this is real hair?" And yes, it is. So here's the question. Is it creepy? Or is it kind of beautiful? In a world increasingly disconnected from death, where mourning is rushed, grief is tidied up with platitudes, and funerals are planned like dinner parties, maybe the Victorians got something right. They held on to grief, Literally. They didn't hide it in euphemisms or slap on a filter. They looked it in the eye and said, "You're staying with me." It wasn't always graceful. It certainly wasn't sanitary, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty looks like a ring made of sorrow and hair. So next time someone says, "I'll never forget you," ask them, "Would you wear a bracelet made of my scalp?" If the answer's yes, well, congratulations. That's love. Coming up next, we're diving straight into the most bleakly transactional chapter of them all. Orphans. For rent. Because when emotions weren't enough, Victorians found ways to monetize even that. Ah, the Victorian era. A time of romantic letters, elaborate mourning rituals, and checks notes rentable orphans. Yes, you read that right. Not adopted, not fostered, rented. Temporarily borrowed, like an umbrella you forgot to return. Except instead of a rainy day accessory, it's a child. Because when society ran on spectacle and sentiment ran on visuals, and visuals needed props, what better prop than a conveniently quiet, thoroughly impoverished child? Let's break this down. First, we need to understand the Victorian obsession with optics. Appearances mattered. Whether it was your morning jewelry made of Cousin Harold's hair, or your ability to show how charitably miserable you were, the public performance of virtue was everything. Charity wasn't just a moral duty, it was status theatre. And no scene was complete without a child who looked like they hadn't smiled since the Crimean War. That's where orphans came in. Institutional orphanages were bursting at the seams. Abandonment was common, due to poverty, death, or general inconvenience. Workhouses were full, almshouses overflowed. So charitable organizations and enterprising individuals had a light bulb moment. Why not loan these orphans out? For events, for photo ops, for funerals, for atmosphere. Need to project a pious image? Rent a few orphans to flank your front pew at church. Planning a melancholic photograph to showcase your philanthropic grief? Rent a quiet child who can cry on cue. Hosting a charity dinner? Toss an orphan at each end of the table for emotional balance. Let that sink in. Small, malnourished humans used as accessories, because nothing said, "Look how generous I am," like parading a rented child next to your roast goose. It didn't stop at emotional optics. Victorian photography, which we've already established was big on dramatics, loved orphans as set pieces. Wealthy families would pose with the less fortunate, hand on shoulder, gentle expression, the visual equivalent of a virtue signal. "We care," the image whispered. "We touched the poor, and we didn't even flinch." And the orphan, paid in gruel, if that. Some children were loaned out for household labor, under the guise of apprenticeship. They'd be told it was temporary, a week or two, maybe a season. Just a little help around the house. Sweep the floors, mind the baby, help wash the clothes. What actually happened was long hours, physical punishment, and no promise of return. Sometimes the rental arrangement turned permanent, but not through adoption, through forgetting. The child was simply absorbed into the underclass, a nameless maid, a silent scullery boy. They'd disappear into the folds of the Victorian machine, one pair of tiny hands among thousands. Other times, orphans were dressed up and carted along like miniature tragedies to Victorian funerals. Especially popular for the funerals of women or other children, because what better way to underline the fragility of life than a crying child in rags standing beside a velvet coffin? Some were even used as before and after subjects by social reformers. "Look at this child," the pamphlet would begin, "neglected and starving." Then, in a second photo, cleaned up, hair combed, wearing a slightly oversized suit. "Thanks to our charity, little Thomas thrives." But Thomas didn't thrive. Thomas went back to his lice-ridden cot that night, because the photo was a lie. The suit was borrowed, and the charity, mostly fundraising, still watching, still breathing. Okay, breathe that in. The reality that entire systems were built not to care for children but to use them as currency, in public sympathy, in marketing, in moral performance. One particularly delightful example: foundling pageants. These were public parades in which orphans were marched in front of wealthy donors to show off their improvement, often after being freshly washed and dressed in donated clothes. It was like a livestock show, but with more piano recitals and slightly less hay. And no, these children rarely saw the proceeds of the donations they helped generate. Here's a thought: how much is a child worth? when they're not yours, not named, not remembered. The economic structure was simple. Orphanages or workhouses would loan children out for events or labor, either for free, in exchange for food and supervision, or for a small fee that never reached the child. Some enterprising individuals built entire reputations off the orphans in their orbit, and society let it happen, because at least the children were doing something right. Let's not forget, this wasn't happening in secret. It was part of public life. Newspapers sometimes praised the charitable use of orphans in civic ceremonies. The sight of children in rags was supposed to stir you, make you generous, help you part with your coins, and if a few kids got used up along the way, well, such was progress. But the children remembered. We know this because of the few scraps of memoirs and letters that survive. One girl, Sarah, 8 years old, was sent to live with a family for a month-long engagement. She served, cleaned, sat through tea parties, and was made to memorize lines for a eulogy. When she returned to the orphanage, she cried for days, not because of what she'd done, but because she'd seen a world that wasn't hers, and knew it never would be. Somehow, that's the deepest cruelty, showing a child love, comfort, or safety, and then yanking it away, not out of malice, but out of indifference. Eventually, these practices faded, slowly, as attitudes toward childhood evolved, as social reform took hold, and as actual laws started protecting minors from being treated like furniture with feelings. The renting of orphans became less common, but it never completely disappeared. Because even now, we see echoes of it. Children on charity posters, poverty porn campaigns that manipulate viewers through suffering, influencers posing with children on volunteerism trips. The props have changed. The logic hasn't. So next time you see a photo designed to make you feel sorry, pause, ask who's benefiting, ask who's in the picture, and who's profiting from it. Ask whether the child in the frame ever got a copy of the photo. Coming up next, we descend even further into the underworld, quite literally, because if orphans were used above ground, there were others navigating the filth beneath it. Meet the Toshas, sewer treasure hunters with nothing to lose and everything to dodge. Let's pause, not for dramatic effect, though it certainly earns one, but because by now, your mind is probably a montage of coal dust, leeches, dog dung, rotting teeth, and silent children being paraded like porcelain grief dolls. And if that sounds bleak, well, imagine living it. Because underneath the grotesque trivia, the bodily fluids, the fleas and the funerals, there were actual people. People with hearts, memories, inner lives. People who felt things, and most of them were never asked how they were doing. So, let's ask, what was it like to wake up every morning in the freezing dormitory of a workhouse, knowing your name hadn't been spoken kindly in years? What was it like to crawl into a chimney before you had adult teeth, to fish through raw sewage for scrap metal, and maybe a half-rotted boot, and call that a good day? Let's talk about Sarah, a leech collector from Shropshire. She was 12 when her mother first dragged her into the water, not for a swim, but to stand, still as stone, while tiny parasites found their way to her calves. She learned to watch for movement in the reeds. She learned to smile at the apothecary man so he wouldn't underpay. She learned to lie when her legs wouldn't stop bleeding. By 14, she had scars that itched every winter. She died before 20. No obituary, just a note in the local ledger. Child expired from fever. And what about Mary? A match girl from Bethnal Green. She liked singing, not professionally of course, just humming when the overseer wasn't near. She used to press her fingers to her cheeks to check if the phosphorus had started to rot her bones. One day she coughed and half a tooth came out. She didn't scream, just picked it up and folded it in a handkerchief, something to remember herself by. Let that sink in. These girls lived and died in silence. Their labour was visible. Their pain was. Victorian England was a machine, a towering, soot-caked machine, and it ran on the bodies of the poor. Their hands built the roads, their spines bent under the weight of others' comfort, their lungs filled with soot, with ammonia, with chemicals. But you wouldn't see them on the coins, or the portraits, or the marble busts. The emotional toll wasn't just sadness, it was erasure. These people didn't get to grieve properly. They didn't have time. They didn't get mental health days. They got scolded for crying, punished for resting, ignored when they screamed. Their deaths weren't tragedies, they were statistics. Still watching? Then stay with me. Because behind every horrible Victorian job we've unpacked, behind every chapter full of dung and disease, there's a beating heart that kept going, out of duty, out of survival, out of nothing more than the stubborn desire to exist in a world that told them not to. Children, especially, bore the heaviest weight. Victorian society saw them as blank slates, but only when it was convenient. Otherwise, they were tools, resources, little mops for big messes. You could beat them, sell them, rent them, silence them, and call it character building. But if you peel back the soot, if you brush the grime from the margins, you find something more precious than any tosh from a sewer: dignity, in scraps, in glimpses, in tiny rebellion. Like the tosher who named his pet rat King George, or the match girl who pocketed phosphorus to draw stars on her dormitory wall, or the night soil man who carved poems into the inside of his bucket. Because even in the stink of humanity's lowest bowels, there was room for art. The emotional toll is cumulative. It seeps in. Over time, it becomes generational. Trauma passed down like heirlooms. A fear of hunger, a mistrust of authority, a voice in your head that says you're only worth what you can produce. We don't often tell these stories because they're not tidy. They don't end with success. There's no redemptive arc where everyone learns a lesson. Many of these people didn't live long enough to be remembered, but they matter. Not because they were noble, not because they were perfect, but because they were human. And being human in Victorian England was often a miracle of endurance. Now you might be wondering, why dredge all this up? Why wade through this ocean of historical misery? Because it's not just history, it's a mirror. Modernity may have swapped the leeches for apps, the dung for data, the child chimney sweeps for warehouse teens in heat stroke. But the system's exploitation, silence, invisibility haven't vanished. They've just evolved. That's what the emotional toll teaches us. It's not about pity, it's about awareness. It's about recognizing that behind every underpaid, overworked human is a story you were never told. And maybe, just maybe, it's about doing better with the stories we tell now. We end this chapter, not with a scream, but with a breath. A long one. So yeah, breathe that in. The fog of coal smoke, the sting of injustice, the quiet defiance of someone who keeps waking up anyway. Coming up next, we drag this mirror all the way to the present, because gig workers, underpaid labourers, and essential employees might not be covered in soot, but the echoes of Victorian hardship are still walking beside them. So here we are, the final stop on this tour of Victorian horror, the part where we wipe the soot from our eyes, brush the flea eggs off our collars, and ask the one question that makes history actually matter. Are we still doing this? Short answer, yes. Long answer, oh absolutely yes. But with better branding and fewer open cesspits. Let's get the obvious out of the way. No, you probably didn't wade barefoot into a leech-infested swamp this morning, hopefully. And you likely haven't been paid in soup or beaten with a chimney brush since childhood. Progress. Gold star. But just beneath the surface of all our shimmering screens and ergonomic chairs is a workforce stitched together by low wages, high expectations, and public invisibility. If Victorian England had leech collectors, we have warehouse pickers. If they had to share scavengers scraping sewage for coins, we have gig economy workers driving 14 hours to barely cover rent. And before you say, well, it's not the same, you're right, it's worse in some ways. Because now, you're not just exploited, you're also supposed to smile through it, film it, and thank the algorithm for your unpaid exposure. Let's take the modern independent contractor. On paper, you're a free agent. In reality, you're beholden to app notifications, 5-star ratings, and a faceless corporation's surge pricing model. There's no health insurance, no union, no stable income, but hey, you can wear sneakers, so that's cool, right? Pause and think, how different is that from the pure finder who scavenged dog waste without gloves, just to afford stale bread? At least they weren't being told to build their brand while doing it. And then there's essential workers. A phrase that got a standing ovation in 2020 and a pay cut in 2021. These are the people bagging groceries, scrubbing hospital floors, delivering your last-minute headphones at 10 p.m. on a Sunday. They're the backbone of daily life, just like the match girls, the coal boys, the night soil men. Only now, instead of phosphorus poisoning, it's chronic back pain, burnout, and the slow, soul-sandpapering erosion of dignity. Let that sink in. Again. Slowly this time. It's not about doom and gloom. It's about clarity. The emotional toll of exploitation hasn't vanished. It's just been airbrushed. The jobs still exist. The difference is now, we pretend they're choices. You're not being exploited, you're hustling. You're not underpaid, you're on your grind. You don't need sleep. You need to want it more. Sound familiar? That's Victorian workhouse logic in a zip-up hoodie and a motivational podcast. And then there's child labour, which, to be clear, we outlawed in most places. But not everywhere, and not completely. Fast fashion still depends on it. So do certain agriculture and manufacturing sectors around the globe. You may not see them, but trust me, some kid somewhere is threading your sneakers' shoelaces right now, while you listen to this video to fall asleep. Irony? She's thick tonight. But it's not just about comparing job conditions. It's about who gets remembered. Victorian history is full of monuments to aristocrats, generals and industrial barons, the people who benefited most from the labour of others. Meanwhile, the leech collector, the mudlark, the girl who glowed in the dark until her jaw fell off. No statues, no street names, just footnotes, if that. Modern parallels exist there too. Our news cycles spotlight billionaires, influencers, and digital titans, and bury the grocery cashier who stopped a robbery, the janitor who mentored a whole generation of kids, the delivery driver who risked snow and traffic to make sure your sick grandmother got her meds on time. So let's shift the lens, just for a moment, because sometimes history isn't about villains and heroes. Sometimes it's about the ordinary people who did what they had to do, who survived filth and famine, heartbreak and hard labour, not because they had a choice, but because they didn't. The legacy of Victorian misery isn't just in the archives. It's in our economy, our gig apps, our social hierarchies. It's in the way we value convenience over ethics, labour over humanity, and productivity over well-being. But there's a silver lining, and no, it's not arsenic-based like the wallpaper. It's awareness. Awareness breeds change. Telling these stories, remembering these names, confronting the past, that's how we avoid repeating it, or at the very least how we stop pretending we're better when we're not. And maybe, just maybe, there's inspiration in that too, in the endurance of people like Sarah and Mary, in the anonymous hands that kept cities running, in the fact that even in the grimmiest corners of history, you'll always find a glimmer of resilience. So here's to the leech collectors, the sewer divers, the girls with phosphorus smiles. And here's to the modern echoes, the underpaid, the unseen, the tired, but still trying. You're not just a cog in the machine. You're the reason it doesn't collapse. Now, take a deep breath. You made it to the end of this odyssey. From mud to mourning brooches, from rented orphans to algorithmic burnout. And if you're still watching, still listening, then I have one final request. Like, subscribe, or just whisper thank you to the next essential worker you see, because history doesn't repeat itself. We do. History is full of the forgotten, the filthy, and the downright foul, but every one of them, from leech collectors to mudlarks, shaped the world we live in. If that blew your mind or made you grateful for your desk job, hit like, subscribe, and maybe thank your toilet. It's doing a lot of emotional labor these days.